You're good.
All right, guys. Welcome to Wellness Wednesday. This is Dr. Mike Roncesvalles. Super glad that you're here with us and super glad that we're able to take a few minutes the day before Thanksgiving. Pretty big day. The eve before we kind of step back and as a nation just be thankful for what we have. So I'm just really privileged to be able to have a few moments with you. It's going to be longer today. I'm just going to tell you that. I'm going to tackle a difficult topic, and I thought it was important leading up to the holidays to start to talk about, some of the things that happen that end up creating issues, especially for us over the holidays. Because what happens is we get triggered by people, relationships, stress, and before we know it, our issues, our underlying issues start to come out. And that's why we can have so many problems with even like addictions that start to surface during the holidays, or people get depressed, they get lonely. You get triggered by all your family of origin, ultimately is what it is. And so you hang around these folks, and look, the family of origin is the most powerful system that you'll ever be a part of. So a lot of you, not all of you, but a lot of you are going to be around your family for the next 4 weeks, right? And that's why we see people in our Live Well clinics just calling like crazy. We can't handle the volume of the calls that come in for people that want help. They just want to figure out, man, how do I feel like myself during the holidays? So we're gonna tackle this with you at Live Well Coaching, right? That's why we're doing this. So today we're going to talk about trauma. I just wanted to take a minute and say, okay, the past impacts the present. It does. When you're triggered by, what your mom or your dad, your siblings, your aunts, your whatever, it's not so much what's happening right here, right now. It's what's happening right here, right now, plus all this unfinished business that you have from things that have happened historically. Maybe between you, maybe it's not even between you. Maybe it's just some things that have happened that ultimately you've not really resolved, and somebody else is kind of going to pay the bill because you're triggered and you're feeling overwhelmed and stressed. So we're going to take the 2 weeks before Christmas. So I think we're starting on December 10th. And we're going to specifically talk about how to have a less stressed holiday. So everybody wants that information, right? I hope you guys can join us for that. It's going to be a challenge. It's going to be 14 days that together you and everybody else in the Live Well community is going to be working together to say, okay, we're going to do this differently. But this session today is just a little bit of a backdrop for that, because I want to point out the power of the past in your life. And so producer Cam over there was saying, hey, what are we going to title this Wellness Wednesday? And I decided to title it the power of trauma in your everyday life. The power of trauma in your everyday life. The past impacts the present. I'm going to tell you how. So start with just a little bit of the background. This is a big deal for me. Like, the idea of even talking about trauma is big for me. I'm a cognitive behavioral psychologist. What that means is I was trained to look at what's happening right here, right now. And in some ways, my training taught me to not frown upon, but to not really pay attention to some of the issues that we go through early on in life. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is all about like, hey, here's what's happening right now. Like here's how you go forward. Here's how you begin to kind of monitor and understand your thoughts, and how your thoughts drive your feelings, and then how your feelings drive your behavior. I was super attracted, and am still super attracted to that, because I like feeling empowered, right? I like feeling empowered for the clients and the patients that I work with. I don't want to be the victim of the past. And that's always been sort of this thing with me about, man, I don't want to camp out and talk about my dad did this, or my mom did this, or I was bullied in 6th grade. I want to talk about right here, right now. And I do. And that's how I work. And that's the majority of the work that I do with people. But I've learned something along the way. And what I've learned is, man, we can be in situations where it's difficult to function in the present, in the moment, because we're dealing with issues from our past, and the trauma in particular impacts us. So I've done close to 30,000 face-to-face hours with patients. That's a wild number. I've spent literally 30,000 hours in my career talking with people one-on-one, or doing family therapy or marriage therapy in a clinical office. And what I've found is that, man, people come in with all kinds of issues, right? So I've done marital therapy with people in their 20s just launching into marriage. I've done marital therapy with people in their 70s that are still fighting about the same things they did in their 20s. I've seen middle-aged women and men paralyzed by depression. I've seen older people just crippled by anxiety. I've had thousands of hours that I've spent with people struggling with addiction to alcohol, drugs, pornography, gambling, you name it, man. I've dealt with addictions for years. And as I've progressed in my career over those 30,000 hours, I've seen some themes. I've seen some things come out in people's lives. Like, for instance, I know that people pleasing is a relational style that can be a catalyst for all kinds of problems over time. I know that. I deal with it all the time. Perfectionism. I know that perfectionism is another problem that contributes to a multitude of diagnoses. Like, there's all kinds of things that are rooted in perfectionism, like OCD and eating disorders, and a lot of times addictions. But over the last few years, I've stumbled across one mental health theme that is connected to an overwhelming majority of clients' issues. And it is trauma. It is the past. And if I spend enough time with the client, it's almost inevitable that they end up disclosing some sort of underlying trauma that's a part of the clinical picture in some way. So it doesn't matter whether it's an acute issue like depression or anxiety, or a long-term problem like an addiction, or even like borderline personality disorder. Trauma comes to the surface as an overarching theme in many people's history. And maybe you've never been to therapy. Maybe that's not where you're at. Maybe you've never had like depression or anxiety, and you're on this platform because you just want to get healthy as you can and stay as healthy as you can. My encouragement to you is, don't turn this Wellness Wednesday off. Don't mute this information in your life, because what I really have come to understand is that it doesn't matter how awesome our childhood was. It doesn't matter how amazing things are. Everybody has dealt with things, right? Everybody's had something in their life that you can look back to and say, man, there were moments where I was struggling. And I think if you can just be honest about that, it actually helps you identify the blind spots that you have in your life. And it helps you be an even better professional, an even more competent athlete, a more caring spouse, a more engaged parent. Like, when we understand the things in our life that we're kind of blind to, and we can address them, and you really understand how your past is trying to impact your present, you're better. It just in every area of your life. So in the therapeutic world, we call that trauma-informed therapy. For us on this Live Well coaching platform, we're just going to call it like a trauma-informed theory of being, right? Like the idea that our past impacts are present. So start with kind of the difference between a big T trauma and a little t trauma. And a lot of people, when they think about trauma, they say, oh, no, that's not me. In fact, that would be me, honestly. I would say I've not really suffered what most people consider trauma. I've had like pretty crazy life in some ways, and I've not dealt with like these massive issues. Grew up in a pretty healthy family, kind of navigated high school and college and all these things pretty well. So I don't look back and say, oh man, there's all these massive things that went wrong. But that's because the way we're talking about trauma and the way I used to think about trauma was directly connected to what we call big T traumas. And so big T trauma would be a sexual assault, the combat experience of a veteran. We used to run a veterans program, and man, dude, I heard all about traumas. It's crazy what our veterans have been through for us. It's wild. The sudden death of a loved one. My loved one died in a car accident, or unexpectedly passed away. Those are big T traumas, and they have a huge impact. I know that doesn't surprise anyone, but really big T trauma can result from any experience that you have that's deeply disturbing and infringes upon your ability to feel like you can control life and death. That's the key to all of it. So you have a massive car accident. Some people will walk away from that car accident fine. Other people will walk away and they have PTSD. Why? Because something about that experience made them feel like, I'm just not in control of life and death. But over the last few years, what researchers have started to recognize is there's a difference between big T trauma and little t trauma. Little t traumas are repeated, prolonged events that exceed our capacity to cope and cause a disruption in emotional functioning. So these distressing events are not like big T traumas in that they're not inherently life-threatening, but just like the big traumas, the little consistent things that happen over and over again leave us feeling helpless. They leave us feeling vulnerable, and they leave us feeling powerless, to feel like almost like we can't deal with the circumstances that are in our life. So here's an example of like a little t trauma: chronic legal or financial problems. So if you've had a bankruptcy following you around for years, or you're dealing with a custody battle with your kids that happens over and over and over again, that's a little t trauma. Persistent bullying. People don't really recognize that, but kids that get bullied over and over and over again in school, that has a huge impact upon the way they see themselves and the way they see the world, and it makes them feel really powerless. So we think, oh, that was sixth grade, it didn't matter. Well, for some people it doesn't. For some people it matters a lot. Another example would be like a series of intense, emotionally abusive relationships. So you might be one of those people that you can look back and say, I had a string of guys that I dated, and they were every one of them abusive, manipulative. Some of you, I dated, or I was married to two women, and man, for years, they just criticized me every day, over and over and over again. It's tough. It's called a little t trauma. Even going through infidelity or divorce, like if that's happened in your relationship, that's a little t trauma. Think about it. Like a divorce it's every day. You're thinking about, I wonder what's going to happen now, and we've got to worry about this. Infidelity would be the same thing. People wake up and they're like, oh man, what's happening, and what is my spouse going to do today, and what are they going to say, and am I okay, and am I enough, and all that's a little t trauma. Growing up in an unstable family, it doesn't matter how awesome your family was, if there were elements of it that were unstable, that's a little t trauma. So a lot of you that had alcoholic parents, that's traumatic. Those of you that had a critical mom over and over and over again, she just never let you alone, that's a little t trauma. Those of you that had an abusive father, that's little t trauma. So obviously there's nothing about the little t traumas that are life-threatening per se, but the build-up of these kinds of experiences over time. It's not like it happens one time. Like if you got criticized by your mom once, it's all good, right? Like, no, usually that's not going to cause an issue where you feel like out of control of life. But if you got criticized by your mom every day for a year or every week, something, it's the buildup of that over time that has an impact upon our emotional life. And most people who decide to start therapy do so because of the buildup of these little t traumas. That's a big statement I just made. Most people that start therapy go to therapy because of the buildup of a little t trauma, this thing that just won't go away, that feels uncontrollable, and that feels like I'm at its mercy. So one of the most kind of overlooked aspects of the little t trauma is their accumulated effect. While like the one little t trauma might not lead to a significant distress, multiple compounded small traumas, that's what's likely to cause issue, especially in a short period of time. So if you lost your job and lost your wife or your husband and had to go back to school, usually that kind of thing is going to happen in a small window, right? Like 2 years. I did all of that. That's going to change your brain. And in a minute, we'll talk a lot about how and why it changes your brain. And the neurological research on it is what's really shifted my ability to kind of be open to talking about this with people, because it does change your brain. Little t traumas change your brain the same way big T traumas do. It's hard to believe, but if you scan people's brains, the brain of someone that's been through a bunch of little t traumas looks very similar to the brain of the soldier that's come back from war, or the person who's gone through a sexual assault. Crazy, wild to even consider, but it is true. I'm gonna keep saying this because of how I'm oriented therapeutically and kind of how I'm wired. I'm not telling you this to say, well, if you've been through this kind of thing, then you get a pass. Like, you're all good. Don't worry about it. No matter what's going on in your life, it's your mom's fault or your dad's fault. That's the last thing I'm saying. I'm saying if that kind of thing has happened, in the way we've described it, a lot of people have experienced either a big T trauma or a little t trauma. If that kind of thing has happened, it is responsible. It's incumbent upon you for you to allow yourself to say, okay, I've got to address this in my life. It's my responsibility to heal the trauma. Doesn't matter. Like, do you think your boss really cares whether what you've been through and what happened? He can't, right? Like, your boss can't manage your past. Do you think your spouse should pay the bill for issues that you had with a boyfriend or a girlfriend in college, or multiple boyfriend or girlfriends in college? No, I mean, it's not fair, right? We're responsible to respond to this. So please don't hear anything I'm saying that I'm saying, well, because we've all had these traumas, then we just don't need to work on it and everybody's got to, cut us all this slack. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, let's be aware of this stuff and let's work on it together. Okay, so I want to kind of look at the interplay of emotion and trauma, and it's hard to understand why trauma dramatically affects some people while others seem to just move past it without long-term consequences. And I think that's true. I think a lot of you will say, I went through this. I have no idea why it bothers me so much. I really don't know why I'm still stuck on, what happened to me when I was in my late 20s and I lost that job, and why I still think about what that boss said when I know that 10 other people lost their job that day and it hasn't impacted them in the same way. And as I've worked with clients, I've noticed that way a traumatic situation impacts a person is largely dependent upon certain things. Number one, like a person's worldview, their beliefs, their expectations, their perceptions, their values, and really their ability to regulate emotion in the moment. So, for instance, why do some young people who experience devastating trauma and violence growing up in the inner city, these people that grow up in the hood and they just have all, my mom was turning tricks in the next room and I had to get covered to walk into school, why do some of them develop significant problems with addiction while others go on to have incredible success in business or education. Isn't that weird? You hear those stories, you're like, man, how did that guy turn out a surgeon and this guy turned out a drug dealer? Why do some soldiers who experience war deal with the terrible symptoms of PTSD, while others seem to move just seamlessly back into society? They can just go back to civilian life and cope. So obviously the answer to these questions is complicated. I'm not trying to minimize, individual differences, but we're starting to find clues as to how traumatic events end up creating havoc in some people's life. And so the answer is connected to how an individual's worldview and expectation facilitate or block their ability to process the traumatic experience without the presence of significance avoidance. So to put it simply, the more an individual avoids feeling, the more power the trauma has going forward. Isn't that wild? Kind of gets back to our last Wellness Wednesday where we talk about that psychological flexibility. I'm going to say it again. The more an individual avoids feeling, especially the negative emotion of the trauma, the more power the trauma has going forward. So that has a ton of relevance. And when you think about it, it makes sense. Something's happening to me. Let's say I'm bullied in high school, and I feel like I'm on the out, and I never feel like I was in. And if I don't let myself recognize that as a young guy in high school and kind of be honest about it and say, man, what am I going to do about this, and deal with it, and maybe talk to somebody about it, those are the people that are going to be impacted more by the trauma. Does that make sense? If you inversely say, man, I'm going to just reach out, I'm going to let myself be honest about this, I'm going to let myself acknowledge it, I'm going to try to work through it, I'm going to try some strategies to help me work through it, those people tend to navigate better. So when we don't allow ourselves to process the negative emotion, what we're really doing is we're minimizing the pain caused by the trauma. And that leads to tons of repression. And it's the repression that causes the problem. When we push the emotion down, that's why the past has power. The truth is the past shouldn't have power over our lives right here, right now. We shouldn't bring all this baggage into Thanksgiving or Christmas. We should be able to sit at tables with people that have hurt us and kind of just be able to do it and kind of work through it. But the more repressed it is, the less you've addressed it, the less you've healed it, the more power it's going to have. By the way, I want to make sure I say this too. There are some people that are so toxic that you really can't sit down at a table with them. I get that. So please don't ever feel like I'm minimizing that experience. So if you're a person and you suffered sexual abuse at the hands of a family member, dude, I totally understand that. You're not going to go sit down and be like, hey, Uncle Joey, glad to see you. Look, there's moments where you've got to draw boundaries with people. And I'm not saying anything about the health of good boundaries when you need them. I am saying that most of us need to look back and say, what are the little T traumas that have happened that I'm still carrying with me? I'm still carrying all that pain and all that frustration. Because if you don't let yourself address it, it's the repression that actually gives the trauma power. So the research is pretty clear here. The research shows that unprocessed trauma is literally stored in a different part of the brain. And that's what I was alluding to earlier. So with this in mind, it's clear that the avoidance of trauma and the negative emotion that it creates is inside of us in one of the most problematic ways, because it's literally stored. Those memories are stored in a different part of the brain. And so they're there and they activate emotion very easily. So the best way to describe how avoidance of negative emotion primes people who have experienced trauma is to use the metaphor of a cell phone. So I love this, right? So I brought my cell phone here. I'm wondering if I probably can't show you, but I'll take it out and do it right now. I'm opening it up. Here's my cell phone. I'm gonna get my iPhone here. Maybe you can see that. Look at all that. I didn't plan this, I promise you. Look at all those open apps in the background. My wife, it drives her crazy, man. Sometimes she'll be like, what are all those apps doing open? They're running in the background of your phone. It's taking all your battery. give me your phone. And she starts closing all the apps out because she knows that I shouldn't have all those apps running in the background because it drains me. Well, think about that. Your brain is the same kind of processor, right? It's processing information the same way your cell phone is. So we can have all these unopened memories, all these memories that are just repressed and they're down there. It drains you emotionally. Does that make sense? So you got all this stuff just like you're thinking about and but you've never resolved it and it's still back there. And that's why you can have someone sit down at the table with you tomorrow at Thanksgiving and they'll say something in a benign way. And this person might have never messed with you. You know what I'm saying? They've done nothing to you. Yet they'll trigger one of those things that's still running in the background. It's unresolved. It's this trauma. It's this little thing that you've never quite dealt with. And all of a sudden, it's anger. It's fear, it's frustration, it's irritation. And guys, we're responsible for that, right? We can't keep going to holiday parties. We can't keep showing up in marriages and we can't keep showing up at work with these unresolved issues, just like these apps running in the background, priming us with all this emotion to just react to people. We're responsible to deal with this stuff. All right. The result of all this is significant, and I just am quickly going to point this out. You know, if you look at trauma and what trauma does in our brain and our body, it's linked to some things that are just super destructive. So if you're watching this and you're struggling with an addiction of any kind, I'm talking addiction to alcohol, drugs, marijuana, which, by the way, you can be addicted to, just saying. Shopping. I'm going to say that again. Shopping. Like some of you get so many Amazon Prime boxes every day that they think you work for Amazon. There's an Amazon truck in your driveway all day long, right? Because you're addicted. Like you're looking for something to medicate your emotions. Pornography, people pleasing, food. Did I just say that? I just said, yeah, you can be addicted to food, high fat, high sugar foods. If you have an addiction, it's highly correlated with this unresolved trauma. There's also very specific diagnoses that are connected. You guys know PTSD is connected, but there's also something called complex PTSD. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. And complex PTSD is like water dripping in an old leaky faucet. It's the chronic little traumas that happen over and over and over again that can actually be very distinctly kind of powerful in your makeup. So that CPTSD diagnosis is highly connected, obviously, to trauma. So you've got a connection between trauma and these very specific mental health diagnoses. You also have a connection to this trauma and the specific changes in the brain. Let me just tell you quickly kind of what it does, because this was the deal breaker for me. I'm going to tell you that again. Before I got this information and before we were able to really look at the brain, it was harder to sell me on how powerful this really was. But let me tell you what it does. Trauma changes how memories are stored. So, yeah, most memories are narrative in nature, and they're encoded using language and words. So almost like I went to a ball game. I went to the University of Florida LSU game a couple weekends ago. It was a great game, by the way. It's awesome. Probably the most exciting football game I've been to in a long decades. It was amazing. And it was so amazing that I will remember. In fact, I want to talk about it right now because it's like eliciting all this cool emotion. I'm not going to. I'm going to spare you guys the detail. But man, I could tell you everything. I could say, man, we sat there and everybody had their phones out and everybody was singing the songs and Florida, came back and won. It was phenomenal. And every piece of that narrative, I can attach language to it. Every piece of that narrative, I can attach language to. We parked in a parking lot. We went and grabbed food, and then we went and sat in our seats. They were awesome seats, by the way. So You see what I'm saying? Like that's a normal memory. You guys can do that. You can tell the story of how you got to this Live Well coaching platform or how you got to this Wellness Wednesday. I told my spouse that I was going to jump in there and do Wellness Wednesday. I went to the refrigerator, I grabbed water, I walked in my office, and I pulled up the platform. That's a typical memory. That's where normal memories are stored. Traumatic memories, they literally are stored in a different part of your brain. So rather than the narrative, the narrative memory is stored in the hippocampus. So that hippocampus has a direct connect to your frontal lobe. So your frontal lobe can make sense of everything, right? Your frontal lobe is where it's like where you articulate the words you're going to say. The frontal lobe is judgment and reasoning and sort of creativity and hope. That's where all of those high level structures are located, and it has direct relevance to a typical memory. I can make sense of my world when my frontal lobe is turned on. But during trauma, the amygdala, the back of your brain, it's about the size of an almond, and it is the seat of fight or flight, man. That is where fear lives in your brain. When you perceive a situation as threatening, and it doesn't have to actually be threatening, by the way. That's the kind of the crazy part about trauma, is it doesn't have to actually be threatening. You just have to perceive it as threatening. I was walking down the street and the shady looking character was coming towards me, and I promise you, I was almost mugged Monday night. Well, that guy might have been, walking home to visit his wife and his kids. But because I perceived it as threatening, my frontal lobe shut down and my amygdala turned on. Think about that. The part of my brain that connected to my hippocampus, like this normal memory of, judgment, reasoning. Well, it's probably okay. He's not being threatening. All that goes out the window. My frontal lobe is dormant. If we scan my brain in that moment, it's not working, and my amygdala has hijacked my entire brain. And this little almond now is trying to help me make sense of this situation. And guess what? The little almond is terrified at all times. That's what it does. And guess what's not connected at all? Judgment, reasoning, right? And so those memories, we call them implicit emotions, meaning there's no narrative attached to it. It's encoded using emotions and somatic experiences. And so these are very, very core emotions. I'll give you one that's positive. An example of something positive that would be an implicit memory would be when I walked into Thanksgiving Day lunch at my Aunt Mary's house. I'm from a huge family up on North Merritt Island, Florida. My family were citrus farmers. We all lived out in the middle of the orange groves, and we'd all converge on my aunt's house at Thanksgiving, right? It's awesome. 70, 80 people there. Man, I remember opening that door and you could just smell lasagna. The smell of lasagna would just hit me. And I have this really, really positive emotion when I smell whatever. I don't even know what it is. I don't know whether it's like pasta cooking or what that is. Maybe it's cheese. But I know when I walk into my local Italian restaurant here in town, there's a guy that has an Italian restaurant. I love it. It's from Sicily, by the way, where my grandparents were from. I open the door to that restaurant. It's the same smell. It makes me feel good, man. Like seriously, I just go in there. I probably eat too much because I'm feeling good. That's an implicit memory. And that memory is connected to smells and to emotions of well-being. But PTSD memories, like these traumatic memories, they're implicit memories too. And they're highly connected to what? Fear. Make sense? So instead of having this memory and the ability to think it through, I have a memory that is attached to fear. And that's all it is. And some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've had experiences in the past and maybe they felt like they shouldn't even be that big of a deal, but you can think about the embarrassment you felt when that guy left you or that girl left you at that college campus as your first heartbreak. And man, you have all that embarrassment just come up immediately. That's a little t trauma. And you have a memory and an emotion, and they're fused. So you can see trauma memories are just stored different, and they're disconnected from the narrative. That's why they're so powerful. That's why a lot of you will walk into some of these situations with your family during the holidays, and you will be triggered, and you don't even know why you're triggered. It's like, man, why am I ticked off right now? Like, I'm pissed. Why? Why am I nervous? Why am I anxious? Some of you don't know why you're anxious when you sit with your own family. Well, it's because there's some things that you've never really processed and you've never really understood. And your hippocampus is not where the memory's stored. Your frontal lobe is not really functioning, and you're literally operating out of the amygdala with implicit memories that are tied to negative emotion. Does that make sense? All right. Third result of this trauma. So we've got like this trauma that's connected to these mental health issues. We've got the trauma that creates a different sort of mechanism of memory in our brain. And then we've got a third result, which is like specific and chronic emotional experiences. And traumatic experiences produce like all kinds of problematic emotions in an individual's life over time. And so we don't have to talk about how all these emotions play out. Some of you, look, I think all of us in some ways live in negative emotions at some point, right? There's just moments where, we're dealing with, I'm feeling down, I'm feeling anxious, I'm feeling kind of stressed out about, that's called life, right? But there's a specific emotion that I want to talk about that is tied directly to trauma. And if you experience this emotion a lot, you probably need to re-watch this Wellness Wednesday, because if you had this emotion often, my hunch is there's some underlying trauma that you've never really resolved. Individuals who have significant either big T trauma or little t trauma struggle with a deep sense of personal shame, just like this deep sense of, man, I'm just flawed on some basic level. And many clients I've worked with over the years have memories that hold significant power over their present lives, and that literally drive this deep, deep sense of shame. And so intellectually, they understand, man, I shouldn't feel like this. A lot of people that are watching this, you're like, I don't know why I feel like this sometimes. But it's a difference between like your frontal lobe kind of dissecting of here's how I should feel and here's what I know is kind of true about me. But that's different from what actually happens when I get in these situations that are problematic and that start to activate all these emotions. Adults grappling with shame often feel like they're never good enough. I'll say that again because I think that's actually a huge piece of this. Adults that struggle with shame, the biggest piece is that you never feel good enough. You're like always striving to prove something to somebody, right? I'm going to prove my value. I'm going to prove my competence. I'm going to prove I'm worthy of love. I'm going to prove I'm worthy of connection. And when a childhood shame especially goes unprocessed into adulthood, it can easily trigger intense emotional responses in stressful situations in relationships today. And so psychologists use the word toxic shame to describe the lingering impact of some of these experiences we've had way earlier in life. So if you feel like, man, I'm always struggling with never feeling good enough, then I want you to seriously like loop into this, and I want you to lean into this. Even on the Live Well coaching platform, reach out to some people, maybe think about doing our coaching, because there's some issues in your life that you can directly address. If you feel the toxic shame, a lot of times you'll find it very difficult to accept love from others. Think about that. If you're dealing with this shame that's caused by the trauma, a lot of times you just can't accept love. You just can't accept it. You yearn and sometimes demand respect and admiration. Like I expect your respect and admiration, and if I don't get it, I will demand it. And most of those people, if this is you, you're probably struggling just to feel happy. You just don't consistently feel a lot of joy in your life. So that's connected to low self-esteem. It's connected to perfectionism. It's connected to this deep desire to please other people. It's connected to this deep desire to control outcomes. There's so much there, but I just wanted to kind of highlight that of everything we're talking about, that's a result of these issues that we've had earlier in life that affect us and impact us in the moment. The shame is probably the hardest piece to deal with. And it's the hardest piece to admit to ourselves. So if you're walking in to Thanksgiving, if you're going through the holidays dreading interacting with people, because you know when you get there, you're going to start to feel just like this deep sense of, man, here I am, a 40-year-old lady or a 60-year-old man or a 25-year-old grown woman, and I just don't feel like I should be at the adult table. You know, how many of you feel like I should still be sitting at the kid table? I'm 60 years old. What am I doing here? I feel I'm not enough. Guys, you probably have this shame, this toxic shame that's just pervaded your whole being. And that's the biggest piece that I try to work with people in this idea of trauma, is if we can address the shame, you're really ultimately healing the trauma. So how do you find freedom from all this? How do you find freedom from the impact of this trauma on your brain? How do you find freedom from the impact of this trauma on your emotional life? How do you allow yourself to go through the holidays this year and not deal with all those triggers and all the emotions and all the stress and all the pressure? All right, here's what we do. Number one, you just have to decide you're going to be militant to not let your past define your future. Just don't do it, man. Like, let's just decide together. I'm not going to let what I've been through dictate who I am today. And let's make the decision. We're not going to live in chronic shame, feeling not good enough, letting all these little T traumas impact us any longer. So number one, it's just making the decision. I'm moving on. I'm going to work through this. Number two, how do you do that? How do you work through it? Talk about it. It's crazy, right? I don't even know why it works. That's really why therapy works. I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist. You guys know this. I work very practically with people. I give them strategies to deal with things. But there's something about just the verbalization of all the stuff that actually helps people get better. Talking about shame is the very thing that helps you find distance from your shame. So go back to the beginning of our session here with Wellness Wednesday. What were we talking about? The more we repress, the more power shame has. Well, what is talking about that? When you talk about things, that's you saying, you know what? I'm not going to repress this anymore. Screw that. I'm not afraid of this. And I'm going to verbalize it. You don't have to live in it. You don't have to be the victim of it. But at some point, you've got to find someone that you can just begin to get the shame out in the open with, in just an authentic way. Secondly, you've got to confront the lies of shame. And toxic shame takes root through negative self-talk that was formed really early in life. Some of you are still telling yourself the negative things that your mom or your dad told you when you were an 8-year-old kid. Your mom and your dad, by the way, who were stressed out and overwhelmed and good people who probably loved you. It's not that they're bad people. I refuse to blame parents or people or college roommates or first husbands or first wives. We're not doing that. It doesn't do any good to say it's their fault. The truth is they're broken individuals. And maybe you never need to contact them again. I get it. I understand we need boundaries, but people are broken. And the overwhelming majority of time, they do things out of their own brokenness because they're just dealing with their own stuff, probably their own toxic shame, actually. But many of us are still sort of literally on some level just taking in all of those toxic messages that we heard when we were little, and we're believing them, and we're trusting them. And the path to breaking through all of this begins with the courage to just be vulnerable, with yourself, with other people. And by doing so, you create an opportunity to dismantle the beliefs that shame has installed. So shame whispers, I'm not enough, I'm unworthy, I'm insignificant, I'll never be enough, if people only knew. It's this constant voice, right? It then reminds you of your past experiences from childhood, from adulthood, from college, from your first marriage, from 5 years ago. And then you say, man, those experiences validate those thoughts I have about me. I must be just a piece of crap, because otherwise, why would people treat me like that? And our job is to not just let that unfold in the moment. We've got to confront those lies head on with some truths. And the truths are, I'm sufficient, I'm enough, I deserve love, I deserve connection. I'm not going to let my past dictate my future any longer. And when you transition from those lies to the truth, that's when you start to kind of live in healthy. And what I just described is like sometimes years of work, right? I get that. I know you're not going to walk in tomorrow to Thanksgiving and just be able to say, it doesn't matter. And I know that, I'm still dealing with some of this shame over, this trauma that I went through, but it's fine. I'm not asking you to be Pollyanna, right? I get it. But I can tell you this much. The more awareness you have walking in tomorrow, the more militant you are to say, you know what, God, I'm not gonna let this happen any longer without a fight. I'm gonna fight against the lies. I'm gonna lean into what's true. And I'm gonna do it with power and with authority and with deep, deep conviction that over time it's gonna work. That's gonna help. It might not give you a great, perfect Thanksgiving, but I tell you one thing, it's going to help. The third thing you can do is you can embody confidence in daily habits and in daily practices. So let me tell you what I mean by that. Feelings of worthiness, connection, and wholeness, all those positive things we want to experience, they're not innate. As a matter of fact, they're really not common to the human experience. They're developed through daily habits and daily practices. If you know someone that's insanely confident, they're like, man, how does that person, like, they just walk in a room and they feel like they trust themselves, and I don't know what it's like. They sit down at the Thanksgiving table, they have every reason in the world to like be dealing with their own stuff, and they just seem comfortable in their own skin. How do they do that? I'll tell you how they do that. They do that because they purposely and intentionally develop daily habits and practices. And that merely deciding to confront the lies of toxic shame it's not going to suffice. We've got to actively change our behavior, right? We've already talked about the value of connecting with people. So one thing you can actively change is say, okay, I'm gonna find the healthy people, whether it's a therapist. Obviously, LiveWell has a ton of therapists that can help you, but maybe it's just like a coach. Maybe you're going to go on LiveWell coaching platform and say, I'm going to get somebody that's going to be accountability, encouragement, just someone that's going to work with me and kind of bolster me up. And as they do that, you're going to find that daily practice of just connecting with someone and verbalizing this is going to be helpful. Another thing that helps is just writing this stuff down. Just start writing. We have a journal right on the LiveWell coaching platform. Why wouldn't you use it, man? If you feel like you're one of those people that can say, man, I've never really addressed my past. I've got these little T traumas. I never thought they were that big of a deal, and I should be through them, and I don't know why they impact me, and all the stuff. You're going to say all the things. Why not say, at the very least, I'm going to get on that journal every day, and I'm just going to start writing about this. Do it for 15 minutes. Don't do it for 15 hours. 15 minutes, just daily practices that you can say, I'm going to start getting some of this out. And as you do these daily things, you're going to naturally start to develop habits. And then as you develop those habits and you're writing and you're talking to people and you're allowing yourself to just do the healthy things. We don't have time. I could talk about like exercise and eating, all the things that are healthy. Over time, you're going to start to see that this begins to shift, and you begin to walk out of the power of complicated trauma, these little T traumas, and of the shame that it creates. All right, guys. I could probably talk seriously. I've got notes here. I'm thinking another 2 hours on this, and maybe one day we'll attack this more intentionally, long term, on a Live Well coaching challenge, or maybe we'll do a course on this. I'll promise you that at some point we're going to do a course on it at the very least. But the question is, what do we do now, right? The reason I went through this with you today is I know what happens during the holidays. And I hope you guys have a great time. I hope that tomorrow is an awesome holiday. But I want you to let yourself be honest to say, okay, have I struggled in the past with stress? Have I struggled with like that feeling of not being enough and being triggered by my family in ways that maybe I shouldn't? If that's you, I want you to know there's hope. There's hope. Like the biggest piece of this is the insight to say, wait, I've been letting my past dictate my future, and maybe I haven't been aware of it, and maybe I've just repressed all this emotion, and that's why it still has power, and maybe you can't fix it all before tomorrow. But I know this. I know that you can walk in and say, okay, what I refuse to do is I refuse tomorrow, or when I'm walking into these holiday gatherings, I refuse to live in shame. I'm just not doing it. What I am going to do is I'm going to maybe right before I get there, I'm maybe going to talk to somebody. Maybe you've got a spouse that you can sit down and say, I never really told you this, but check this out. Or maybe you've got a good friend that you can call and say, man, I just want to talk through what happened with this person in my family 20 years ago, because I just feel like if I can just get it out, it might help me process, and it will. And the second thing I want to challenge you with is if what I've talked about today has pushed a button in you, don't just mindlessly get through tomorrow and do business as usual. I really want to encourage you. Let's be intentional this holiday season. Let's do it for the next 4 weeks. Let's say, okay, well, let's not just be a ball of stress and just drag our butts to January 1st and feel like, whoa, thank goodness I got through it. That's horrible, man. This should be and can be and could be like a super sweet moment for you as an individual as you just step back and take a few moments. It's really healthy, like we said last time, to let holidays be holy days. Just set them apart and say, I'm going to do this differently. I hope that everybody listening will use a vehicle that we're creating to help you do that. We've got this less stressed holiday season that it's a challenge that we're going to do on the platform, just like we're doing our gratitude challenge right now. And I hope you guys will do it. It's going to be awesome. So we're doing it the 2 weeks before Christmas. I think it ends the 23rd. I didn't want to like stress you guys out trying to do a challenge during like Christmas Eve and say, oh wait, let me check Live Well Coaching. So we're going to be done before you get to the show. But man, wouldn't it be cool if you could say, I'm going to address some of this leading up to Christmas, and I refuse to just live a stressed out holiday. this year. I'm not doing it. I hope that that's what you decide to do. So if you want to do that, jump on the website. I think by tomorrow, we will have some graphics up and some ways that you can just kind of register for that less stressed holiday season, and you'll be able to kind of have that on your docket. I think what this means is it starts the 10th. I'm pretty sure that's the day, December 10th. So let's all do that together and decide that, man, we're gonna fight to get healthy, stay healthy, and live well this holiday season. I hope you guys have an awesome Thanksgiving Day tomorrow. Dr. Trevor and I did a video for Thanksgiving, so if you guys are on the gratitude challenge, you can look forward to that tomorrow. You'll be able to watch that video, and until the next Wellness Wednesday, I just encourage you guys, do everything you can to live healthy,